Flames tore through the warehouses by the French market, turning flour sacks into smoke and hope into ash. Cordelia Arnault ran straight into it, widowed, broke, and still clutching her husband's burned ledger like it could save someone's name. By nightfall, New Orleans wasn't just hungry, it was dangerous, and when whispers of hidden gold spread through a crumpled The Times-Picayune, her one desperate plan became a target. But the next day, at Algiers Point, she found a wrecked ship that could change everything. Can a sinking city be held together by a single list of names? Subscribe and tell me, where are you watching from? Cordelia Arnault didn't smell smoke until she stepped off Rue Ursulines and into Decatur Street, just past the St. Louis Cathedral where the bells hadn't rung in days. She had risen early, hoping to restock what little remained in her late husband's dry goods stand, a modest setup nestled near the edge of the French market, just beyond the butcher's and to the left of Dufour's fish stall, where the scent of crawfish usually carried before anything else. But that morning, it wasn't brine or blood in the air. It was burning wood, canvas, and something far crueler, promise. By the time she reached the wharfside, the flames had swallowed the first storage barn. Flour dust ignited like gunpowder as crates collapsed into themselves, the sky choked with black ribbons stretching all the way to the levee. Dock workers shouted orders drowned by panic. A barrel of chicory exploded near the market cafe, and Cordelia caught sight of Jean-Paul Leclerc, one of her husband's oldest trading partners, sprinting with his apron aflame. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Instead, she moved forward, one hand gripping the rosary she hadn't touched since Francois's funeral, the other pressing the front of her soot-streaked dress to her ribs as if to hold something inside that threatened to shatter from heat alone. The fire spread fast, too fast for reason. Someone shouted that the blaze had begun in a merchant's tent near Governor Nichols Street, likely a careless oil lamp tipped after a drunken quarrel, but no one could confirm anything over the noise. Men dragged sacks of rice down the cobblestones, while others used broken oars and water pails to fight a force that didn't care who owned what. Cordelia watched as the cart carrying her last shipment of Louisiana sugar, ordered 3 weeks prior from a plantation up the river in Iberville Parish, was kicked over in a panic. The burlap split, granules scattered into puddles, glistening for an instant before being trampled. 2 boys fought over a half-burned sack, screaming in Cajun French and shoving one another into the soot. A woman collapsed near the banquette of St. Philip Street, clutching a wooden spoon and sobbing for reasons no one stopped to ask. Cordelia stepped over fallen produce, broken lard tins, shattered glass that once held honey. She recognized objects, names, brands, Riboul's pepper sauce, Mandeville beans, the green seal of Trem's Cooper Guild burned into what was now cinders. All familiar, all gone. When the main roof of the central depot gave way with a crash that seemed to silence even the river, she didn't flinch. She stared as the last canvas banner of Francois's stall, faded but intact, flared like a final handkerchief to the wind, and was gone. By dusk, the fire had surrendered to itself, having taken what it wanted. What remained was a wasteland of timber, ash, and the scent of loss that had settled into the corners of every collar, beneath every fingernail. Cordelia returned hours later alone and walked the perimeter like a widow, visiting a graveyard with no tombstones. The French market that had once echoed with the clang of fishmongers and the gossip of spice sellers now groaned under the weight of silence. She found what was left of Francois's ledger tucked beneath a warped crate, its leather cover burned at the corners but still whole. She knelt without ceremony and retrieved it like a relic, brushing off ash with the back of her hand before opening to the last marked page. Inside, her late husband's handwriting lived on. Notations of shipments due, names of clients from St. Bernard Parish to Baton Rouge, and a final entry in faint graphite that read simply, "If it holds, we survive." She didn't know if he meant the roof, the stand, or her, but none of it held. Not that day. She folded the ledger against her chest, stood up and turned toward the river with a clarity she hadn't felt since she buried him beside the old Lafayette Cemetery No. 2 under a headstone purchased too early and too small. That evening, she returned to her home on Chartres Street, a two-room flat above a shuttered bookstore that still bore the sign Librairie des Hommes Libres, its letters half erased by time and salt air. The stairs creaked under her, though they always had, and the hallway smelled of damp paper and dust. She lit the oil lamp beside the window and opened the ledger again, now laid flat on the dining table where François used to sort invoices with a chipped mug of café noir. Names filled the pages. T. Dubois, 20 little beans, paid half. El Roux, 3 crates chicory, balance due. Each name was a thread, a person who had once come to them not just for goods, but for steadiness. Some were already crossed out, some weren't. She ran a finger down the list slowly, stopping at the name of a woman who had traded a pair of iron hooks for salt, and then at the name of a boy who always asked for 1 extra apple when his mother turned away. Cordelia looked at the pattern of debts and half-paid exchanges and realized this wasn't just a book of numbers. It was a map of who the city had once been, and a hint, just barely, of what could still be rebuilt. She couldn't say the word out loud yet, rebuild, but something in her spine straightened. Outside, the night was close and noisy, but not in the way it used to be. The usual strumming of banjos from Rampart Street, the bar chatter from La Laurie's corner, even the creak of the ferry docked near Jackson Square. All were absent. Instead, she heard rats. They scurried along the alley beside the flat, emboldened by the dark and by the knowledge that pantries were emptier than ever. She poured herself a glass of water and sat, back rigid, as the sound of them scratching at crates seemed louder than it should have been. It wasn't just hunger in the air, it was fear, the kind that made people do foolish things. She knew what happened when people lost more than they could count. She'd seen it in the days after François' death, when his brothers turned cold and her neighbors stopped knocking. She'd seen it again today in the market, in the eyes of men who clutched burning sacks, not for use, but for revenge. There was no institution coming to help. The Union soldiers stationed by Canal Street had been reallocated to the barracks upriver, and local authorities were more interested in salvaging liquor than grain. Cordelia realized something simple, brutal, and final. No one was coming. And so, in the quiet of that night, beneath a window streaked with soot and the flickering lamplight of a city half broken, she opened the ledger one last time. She didn't write anything new. Not yet, but she pressed the edge of her palm against the page as if to memorize its texture, its weight. Then she whispered each name aloud, one by one, not as a merchant, but as a witness, and when she reached the last one still legible, Monsieur Baptiste, 12 Vétaters rice, full paid, she didn't stop. She flipped to the back, the blank pages, and stared at the empty lines waiting to be filled. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew the ledger would not stay blank. The fire had taken the stall, the goods, the comfort, but it hadn't taken the part of her that remembered. And memory, if pressed hard enough, could become action. She rose from the table, turned down the lamp, and for the first time since François was buried, she didn't dread the morning. Something inside her was still standing, scorched, but solid. Somewhere beyond the river, something was waiting to be built. The next morning, Cordelia left the house with the ledger tucked beneath her shawl and a stubborn certainty in her chest that she hadn't felt since the week François proposed to her on the banks of Bayou St. John. Hunger had not only hollowed out pantries, but made men crueler, shorter-tempered, less predictable. She paid 2 cents to board a pirogue ferrying across the Mississippi, exchanging wary glances with a grocer from the quarter who'd lost his shop to looters the night before. The air above the river tasted like rust and smoke. To her left, the bell tower of St. Alphonsus still stood intact, but even that felt more like a memory than a monument now. On the crossing, she overheard two dockhands whispering about a big haul near Piety Street Wharf, but their tone wasn't hopeful. It was hungry. When she disembarked at Algiers Point, she didn't linger. She walked with purpose along the gravel path, past a tattered sign for the Southern Pacific Rail Depot, and finally came to a place most had forgotten. A half-buried hull of a merchant ship wedged into the mud where the river bent, gutted and left like it owed something. The thing leaned forward like it was still trying to move. Cordelia stood still, arms crossed, eyes tracing every scar in its timber, and whispered to herself, "You're still breathing, ain't you?" Her boots sank slightly in the soft ground as she stepped closer, testing the incline. The hull wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. Its ribs were exposed in parts, the tar between planks dried and curling, and a long, rusted chain hung from one side like a broken arm. She circled the structure carefully, noting where water had receded and where moss had climbed the seams. The main cargo door, though warped, still swung on one hinge, creaking just enough to announce it hadn't given up entirely. Cordelia ducked beneath the opening, heart racing not with fear, but with an odd anticipation. Inside, the air was damp, but not unbearable. The walls retained a coolness that spoke of shade and survival. Piles of coiled rope and broken crates lay in corners, and a collapsed wooden table leaned against the far wall. But it was dry. The kind of dry that made food last longer, that kept mildew and rot at bay. She crouched near the center of the space, brushing her fingers along the grain of the floorboards. "This could hold sacks, barrels," she murmured aloud, and then firmer. "It could hold a city if it had to." She took out the ledger and flipped to a blank page, jotting down measurements, types of goods, a rough list of what could fit where. She was still writing when she heard a deliberate scuff behind her. When she turned, there stood a man she didn't recognize by face, but could place by type. He was older than her by maybe 10 years, face tanned from wind and water, shoulders square like someone who'd spent more time on ships than on land. His coat was canvas, sun-faded, with a patch where a captain's insignia might have been long ago. He didn't introduce himself, just said, "You'll fall through that floor if you don't step careful." Cordelia didn't rise. She closed the ledger and looked him in the eye. "Then you'd better show me where to stand." He didn't smile, didn't move. "This ship's dead," he said flatly. "It's not dead," she replied. "It's resting, same as the rest of us." There was a pause, then a slow nod. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. He stepped into the hull, boots thudding confidently, and tapped one of the beams with the knuckles of his left hand. "That one'll hold. This side here you'd want to reinforce, pitch and scrap wood. Maybe tin." Cordelia watched him test the floor, listened to the certainty in his tone. "You worked her?" she asked. He shrugged. "Worked one like her, before the blockade." His accent was low country Gulf, not quite Creole, not quite Union. "Name's Harlan Keene," he added after a beat. "I fix things, when I care to." "I don't have coin," she said quickly. "Not even trade, not yet." Harlan leaned on the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I didn't ask for coin." Cordelia crossed her arms, tilting her chin in defiance that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with dignity. "Then what are you asking for?" she said. He scratched the side of his face, where a scar ran down from his temple to just below his ear, faded but deep. "Time," he answered. "And quiet. I don't do noise." Cordelia nodded, slow and firm. "You'll have both. In return, we write down every item. Every name. We don't lose track. Not ever again." Harlan didn't flinch. "You'll need locks," he said. "Big ones. Not market kind. Boat locks. Canal kind." Cordelia opened her ledger again and began a new list. Planks, nails, rope, lock types, storage method. She didn't ask for permission. "We'll inventory every delivery. We rotate stock. Barter, no cash, half in, half out. Those with nothing work shifts." Harlan tapped twice on a beam before stepping out into the light. "You talk like someone who's done this before." Cordelia's hand froze over the page. "Not like this," she said quietly, "but close enough to know what happens when no one writes things down." They worked in near silence for the next hour. Cordelia took notes. Harlan tested boards. They spoke only when necessary. She offered him water from her canteen, glass, with a faded Jack's Brewery label still intact on the side. He accepted without a word and returned it with a nod. They made a plan without calling it one. Reinforce the hull with salvaged wood from the burned quarter, lift crates using pulleys from abandoned docks, use tin sheets for patching leaks. They spoke of the city only indirectly. "The rats'll follow the goods," Harlan said, examining the warped deck planks. "Then we get cats," Cordelia replied. "Big ones, mean ones." That got the faintest twitch of a grin from him, but he didn't comment further. When she mentioned the ledger again, saying she'd need a system to track who took what and when, he stopped her. "You keep it honest. They'll come. You don't. They'll burn it down." Cordelia nodded. "Then we'll keep it honest." The unspoken lingered between them. They both knew what was coming: hunger, theft, suspicion, but also need, real, desperate need, and maybe, if they were careful, trust. She could feel it, faint but growing, like the hum of river current under still water. This place, this hull, it wasn't dead. Not anymore. By the time the sun began to sink behind the levee, Cordelia stood at the ship's opening, with her ledger tucked under her arm, staring back toward the city she had crossed from. Smoke still lingered in the sky, but it was thinner now, a reminder instead of a warning. Harlan sat on a crate inside, sharpening a rusted blade with a flat stone, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the nails poking from the frame above. He didn't ask what she planned to call the place. She didn't say. Some names needed to come later, after the thing had earned it. Cordelia flipped to the first blank page of the ledger, drew a neat line down the middle, and wrote 2 columns. In and out. Under in, she wrote salt, dried fish, cloth, matches. Under out, nothing yet. But soon. She didn't believe in omens, but as she closed the book, she noticed the initials on the corner of the crate where Harlan sat. G.A.L. She didn't ask what they meant. Maybe it didn't matter. She met Harlan's eyes briefly, and he gave a single, slow nod. Not approval, not agreement. Just a quiet understanding. The work had begun. They would build something here, not because they had hope, but because they had no choice. By the 3rd week, the hull had taken on the look of something lived in, but not yet trusted. Cordelia's hands were blistered from hammering nails into the new plank walls, mostly scavenged from wrecked market stalls near the riverfront. And her writing hand ached nightly from the hours she spent recording goods in the soot-darkened ledger. Every item that passed into the hull was marked with charcoal symbols and notched with precise inventory. 3 crates of flour from the Trem widow on St. Anne Street, 6 barrels of molasses from the Félicité brothers who'd floated them down from Lafourche Parish, even dried okra wrapped in cloth that still smelled of smoke. Harlan had constructed a pulley rig using old sail lines and the rusted beams overhead, allowing them to lower heavier loads without cracking the flooring. He'd reinforced the entrance with a double bolt system repurposed from a wrecked sugar mill storage room off Esplanade Avenue. "People are watching," Cordelia said one afternoon, peering toward the levee. "They're always watching," Harlan replied without looking up. News spread like mold in the heat. And when a crumpled copy of the Times-Picayune circulated near the quarter's taverns, whispering of contraband held by a widow at Algiers Point, it wasn't gossip anymore. It was a target painted on the hull with invisible ink. By then, Cordelia had begun sleeping inside the ship, tucked behind a stack of sacks filled with cracked corn and powdered eggs donated by a family from Plaquemines, who'd lost their home but not their sense of barter. She had refused a cot. She preferred a wool blanket folded on the floor and her back against a barrel. The ledger stayed within arm's reach, wrapped in a canvas bag that once carried rice. Harlan, ever quiet, patrolled outside in slow loops, leaning on a whittled cane more for balance than intimidation. He didn't speak much at night, but when he did, it meant something. "You smell that?" he asked as dusk bled into dark, nodding toward the north end of the river. "Iron. 2, maybe 3 blades. Close." Cordelia tensed but said nothing. Instead, she extinguished the lantern save for a stub of wax, just enough to write by. Hours passed, with only the chirp of insects and the occasional groan of the ship settling into its foundation of mud and memory. But then, around midnight, came the sound Harlan had been waiting for. Not a knock or a shout, but the soft hiss of breath held too long, and the calculated placement of a foot avoiding the creekboard near the front. Harlan was already crouched near the stern, before the first figure climbed through the broken side wall. They didn't carry torches, too risky, but the glint of metal under moonlight was clear. 3 of them, all lean and swift. Street boys, maybe, or older men shaved down to cruelty. One wore a scarf over his mouth, the kind handed out to porters who still pretended to work at the ferry docks on Canal Street. The others moved with a rhythm that told Harlan they weren't new to this. Inside, Cordelia gripped the ledger to her chest, then quickly set it down. She didn't hide it. She didn't run. When the door creaked louder than expected, she lit the stub of candle and stood between them and the stockpile. "There's nothing in here worth your pride," she said, voice steady but low. No answer came. Only movement. One stepped forward, blade visible, the tip catching a reflection from the wax. "You think this ship makes you special," the man said. His voice was young but bitter. "Makes you better than the rest of us?" Cordelia's fingers trembled just enough to make the lamplight shake. "There's food in here marked for children, for the old. If you steal it, it's not just theft, it's surrender." The words hung there heavy, almost absurd in the face of violence, but she didn't stop. "I wrote your name in this book," she said, lifting the ledger slowly and opening to a page near the center. "Theophile Landry. 2 sacks of lentils received, balance cleared. Paid in full, with labor at the docks, you remember that?" The scarfed one hesitated, something shifting behind his eyes. She didn't look away. "This isn't mine," she continued. "It's yours, all of yours. But if you break it, no one gets it, not even you." The blade didn't lower, but it stopped moving. Silence stretched like rope. Then Harlan stepped forward from the shadows. He didn't speak. He didn't threaten. He just stood there, arms crossed, the scar on his cheek catching the flicker of candlelight like a map of old mistakes. The tension cracked not with sound, but with stillness. One of the men turned, muttered a curse, and vanished into the dark. Another followed. Only Theophile lingered, staring at the open page of the ledger, as if it might say something else. Then he too backed away, eyes locked with Cordelia's, until he disappeared beyond the hatch. No one spoke for several minutes after. Harlan lit a new candle, smaller than the last, and set it beside the ledger. "That's a dangerous book," he said quietly. Cordelia didn't answer at first. She flipped the page, then the next, then the next. "It's not the book," she said eventually. "It's what they see when their name's in it, proof they matter, that someone counted them, not just their sins." Harlan leaned against the wall, chewing something invisible behind his teeth. "You keep it honest," he repeated, "or they'll burn it down." Cordelia nodded, exhaustion pooling behind her eyes. "They didn't tonight." Harlan reached for a nearby crate, pushed it toward the entrance. "They will again," he muttered, almost kindly. "That's how you know it's worth something." Cordelia folded the ledger shut, tied it tight with twine, and placed it back into the canvas bag. Outside, the river was quiet again. Inside the hull, something had shifted. Not victory, not safety, but a reckoning. The kind that lets you sleep with one eye open and still dream something different. At dawn, Cordelia stood at the threshold of the hull, watching the pink bleed into the sky above the far side of the river. She didn't speak. She just adjusted the ledger under her arm, checked the locks Harlan had reinforced hours earlier, and looked toward the city. Somewhere out there, someone would wake up hungrier than yesterday and angrier than they knew how to express. But she would still be here. So would the ledger. So would Harlan. And the hull, battered and scarred, would still stand. It had survived its first test, not of structure, but of purpose. As she stepped back inside, bolting the door behind her, she whispered the words her husband once told her when they first opened their market stall. "If it holds, we survive." And this time, she wasn't speaking about wood or nails. She was speaking about names. The second fire didn't begin near the market this time. It started somewhere off Elysian Fields Avenue, near an old tenement behind the Marigny, where 7 families shared 2 kitchens and a single well. Word reached the quarter as rumor. A lantern knocked over, some fool boiling lye for soap. But when Cordelia spotted the thick line of smoke slashing the sky past the presbytere, she didn't wait to confirm it. The heat that rolled in wasn't natural. It carried urgency. Within half an hour, the city moved like it remembered too late how fragile it really was. Families sprinted down Burgundy Street holding pots with half-cooked beans, bundles of clothes, anything not yet stolen or burned. A woman with a broken sandal carried 3 jars of pickled okra, like they were children. What rattled Cordelia wasn't the panic. It was the direction. People weren't running toward the churches. They weren't heading for government buildings or even toward relatives' homes uptown. They were moving to the river, toward Algiers, toward her. Harlan saw it too, standing atop the ship's edge with a spyglass cracked down the middle. "They're not looking for shelter," he said. "They're looking for proof something still works." They came faster than she expected, dozens at first, then hundreds, trickling in with soot-streaked cheeks and bare feet blistered from stone. A boy no older than 10 clutched a sack of red beans in one hand and his baby sister in the other, wrapped in what looked like part of a cafe curtain. A fisherman from Bayou Lafitte carried a gutted catfish under his arm like an offering, repeating in broken English that he had nothing else but please. Cordelia met them without ceremony. She didn't welcome, she directed. She pointed to where the lines should form, told them what they could bring in, what had to be weighed, what would be recorded. When someone tried to push past her, an older man from Royal Street with teeth missing and eyes glassy with desperation, Harlan stepped between them and said, "You wait like the rest." No shouting, no violence. But the tone settled everyone. When the Union soldiers rode by at a distance, too far to help and too close to ignore, Cordelia barely looked at them. Their blue coats might as well have been ghost sheets. They didn't stop. They never had. Inside the ship, Cordelia tried to keep the rules alive. She opened the ledger to a clean page and drew a line down the middle, as she always did. In on the left, out on the right. Each entry that followed came with a story. 3 ears of corn from the Saint. Bernard family who'd lost their house 2 weeks ago. A tin of chicory exchanged for 2 bandages and 1 hour of shelter. A half loaf of bread traded by a woman who refused to give her name, but whose hands bore the burns of someone who'd stayed too long near the flames. Amid the flood of faces, a young boy stumbled in, with hands red and blistered raw. His name was Elijah, he said. Between tears he tried not to let fall. He hadn't brought anything. His mother was gone. Cordelia didn't ask how. She took the shawl from her own shoulders, lavender-scented, soft with age, and wrapped it around him as she knelt to eye level. "You're in the book now," she told him. "That means you matter, and that you'll eat tonight." That was the rule. You don't write someone's name unless you mean to protect it. By nightfall, the line stretched beyond the reach of lamplight. Harlan rigged torches using glass jars filled with lard and torn cloth. Cordelia stood behind the inventory table, her eyes stinging, her fingers stained with ink and ash. The ledger was no longer just a tool. It was a contract, visible proof that trust still had weight even when everything else had burned. And it worked. No fights broke out, no thefts. People whispered. They helped one another. Someone gave up half their rice to a woman who'd fainted. Someone else passed down a half-used bar of soap. These weren't miracles, they were habits being remembered. Harlan, who never believed in speeches, whispered under his breath, "They're listening to you." Cordelia didn't respond, but she heard him. And more than that, she understood what it meant. Not authority, but responsibility. If you gave people a system that didn't lie to them, they would hold it like rope in a flood. No one had expected the city to choose the Hull, but they had. Not because it was pretty, but because it held. A few cried openly as they passed through the door, not because they were safe, but because they had somewhere to go. And even in their grief, they followed the rules. They pointed to what they brought. They took what was fair. And when Cordelia asked if they could help, many did, shoveling mud from the front steps, drying supplies, cutting cloth into strips for bandages. They wanted to earn their place, not beg for it. That was the difference. At one point, a man with a stitched-up brow and bloodied knuckles stood beside Harlan and asked, "How do we make this stay?" Harlan replied without looking at him, still tightening the rope on the east hatch. "Don't take more than your name can carry," he said, "and don't lie to the book." It was a warning, but also a kind of hope. Cordelia watched the man nod, retreat into the line, and disappear among the others. Not every fire took everything. Some left behind the raw material for something better. Maybe. By midnight, Cordelia closed the book, not because the work was done, but because her hands couldn't write anymore. She rubbed her wrists, sore from repetition, and looked around the hull. Every corner now held traces of other people. Scraps of clothing, bits of food, footprints, breath. It wasn't empty anymore. It was lived in, claimed. The river beat steadily against the hull, not loud but constant, like a second heartbeat. Outside, the fires still danced in the far-off streets of the quarter, but here, in the ship half sunk into the mud of Algiers Point, the city had made a decision. It had chosen where to run when everything else gave way. Not to the church, not to the courthouse, not to the blue coats, to the hull, to the ledger, to something that kept its word. Cordelia placed the book beside her and sat on the floor, her back against a crate marked "Dried Apples, 1862. And in that breathless silence, she understood the cost of being chosen, and the grace of still being standing when the choosing happened. When the fire finally choked itself out, all that was left behind was the smell of scorched cotton and collapsed promises. New Orleans didn't mourn this one aloud. There was no energy left for that. It moved like a patient surviving a fever, slower, quieter, but not yet whole. The riverboats didn't return that day, nor did the officials from the customs house on Canal. What returned was something heavier, a kind of fragile dignity among those who had stood in line and followed the rules, even when their stomachs ached and their hands shook. The next morning, as the haze lifted over Algiers Point, the ship, still muddy, still leaning slightly, was surrounded, but not with suspicion. Faces pressed close, some hopeful, others simply hollow. Cordelia walked among the crates and sacks as if walking through a church built from what people refused to abandon. When she reached the far corner and saw her ledger resting beneath a folded burlap cloth, corners crumpled, cover ink-stained from damp hands, she paused. She picked it up and pressed her thumb gently against a page nearly torn from overuse. The names weren't just names anymore, they were declarations, proof that the people of the city had refused to become animals in the dark. Harlan didn't ask before he mounted the sign. He'd worked on it through the night, salvaging boards from a collapsed storefront on Toulouse Street, carving the letters slowly between other tasks. The plank was nothing fancy, no flourish, no paint, but he burned the letters deep with a piece of rebar he'd found near the port. Armazém de Ponto. No Latin, no French, no name on it. Just truth. Cordelia watched as he nailed it into place, careful not to split the wood, and when he stepped back to inspect it, she didn't clap or thank him. She simply nodded. It wasn't pride. It was weight. Something had been named because something had survived. People began gathering near the stern, where the makeshift ramp still sagged under daily foot traffic. Those who'd once spat at her name now stood in uneven lines, heads bowed in something not quite apology, but far from arrogance. A meeting was called. There were no printed ballots, no official seals, just a large wooden crate used as a podium and a crowd ready to listen. Harlan read the rules they'd drawn up. Rotating watch shifts, limits per family, trade tracking. Cordelia stood beside him and watched men who once dismissed her nod in agreement, some clutching ledgers of their own, scribbled with charcoal and wrapped in wax paper. But the moment that stayed wasn't recorded in any notebook. It happened when the boy with the burned hands, Elijah, returned. He'd been gone for 2 nights, and Cordelia had assumed the worst. But there he was, standing near the crates with a piece of bread in one hand and something folded in the other. The bread was half-eaten, and he looked at it the way one does when deciding whether to finish or save. "This is for you," he said, holding out the folded item. Cordelia took it without speaking. It was a brittle sheet of newspaper, the Times-Picayune, dated nearly a year back, its corners softened by sweat and time. Folded inside was a faded advertisement for a corner store called Maison Fournier, with a woman's name scrawled on the back in pencil, Volto Logo, Maman. Cordelia didn't ask what happened to her. She didn't have to. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. Instead, she bent down, touched the boy's cheek, careful with the skin still raw beneath the healing, and whispered, "You'll go in the book, not under debt, under home." Elijah didn't smile. He only nodded, the way someone older would when hearing news too big to understand. Later that afternoon, Cordelia sat at her makeshift desk with the ledger open to a fresh page, one of the few not water-stained or marked with trade tallies. She dipped the nib in ink, careful not to blot it. Across the top she wrote, "New entries, home." Then in deliberate strokes she added the boy's name, Elijah Fournier. Below that, a note in parentheses. No debt, full standing. She wasn't sure why she added the note, only that it felt right. Harlan watched from across the room but didn't speak. He was sanding down a splintered beam near the rear hatch, the repetition of the motion like breathing. For the first time in days, Cordelia looked out at the ship, not as a project, but as a shelter. There was order here, and something even more rare. Memory. She wondered if that was what people needed most. Not just food, not just structure, but someone who remembered their name and didn't attach it to failure. She closed the ledger and rested both palms on it. It felt heavier now, not from the ink, but from meaning. Outside, people continued to gather, not in panic but in rhythm. They brought odds and ends, half-spoiled onions, fabric scraps, anything of use. But they also brought questions. Can I help patch the roof? Can I trade for thread? Is there work I can do for a blanket? No one asked for a handout. They asked for a role, and that was the real shift. Even the older men, who had once guarded their pride tighter than their purses, stood in line to offer hours of labor. Someone organized a small table for sewing. Another began sorting sacks by grain type. When someone found a broken violin near the wreckage of what used to be a bar on St. Philip, a child fixed one string and played for a moment, just a few notes, but everyone stopped to listen. It was nothing special, but it was something. That evening, Harlan mounted a second plank under the name sign. It didn't say rules or warden. It said, you enter, you carry, you leave, you remember. No one questioned it. As dusk settled, the river began its slow reflection of gaslight and fireless sky. Inside the hull, Cordelia lit a single lantern, just enough to illuminate the desk where the ledger now lay open, its latest entry drying in silence. She traced her finger along the edge of the book, not reading but remembering. Harlan stood at the threshold, arms folded, watching people still working outside in the mud. He didn't speak until she looked at him. "It's not just your ledger now," he said. "It's theirs too." Cordelia didn't argue. She nodded once and turned back to the page, and there, without ceremony, without trumpet or triumph, she pressed her pen to the next line and waited, not for inspiration, but for whoever came next. The boy's name had been written, but something else had been planted. The ledger wasn't just tracking goods anymore, it was recording survivors. At last, when she closed the book and tied it shut with the same twine as always, the ship did not feel like it would sink, not from weight and not from memory. It felt, finally, like it might carry. What did you think of Cordelia's strength, standing between desperate hands and the last food her city had left? Would you have trusted a wrecked ship at Algiers Point, or tried to take what you could? Leave your opinion in the comments. On a scale of 0 to 10, what rating would you give this story? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more intense, emotional stories, where one decision changes everything.